This is lecture 18 and the start of musculature. So in this lecture, we're actually going to be talking about fascicle organization and leverage, the different lever classifications, discuss muscle actions, and then start working our way into the musculature of specifically first the axial muscular system, looking at the face, torso, and vertebral column. Now, the muscular system is a major system of the body, especially when we're talking about the fact that many of you are kinesiology students. This is going to be a large focus of your career. The muscular system accounts for almost half the total body weight, and that's more than any other organ system. It contains about 700 muscles in total, and they vary widely in size, shape, and function. The performance of the muscle varies, and it's entirely dependent upon how the fibers are actually organized and how the muscle attaches to the skeleton. This can even be the case in between people. Different people can have slightly different attachment sites around the same area that can cause slightly different muscle function. It is pretty slight. I want to emphasize that. Now, this is divided into two divisions: the axial muscles, which are going to support and position the axial skeleton, and the appendicular muscles that support, move, and brace the limbs. So talking about the arms, legs, shoulder and hip girdles. Here we can see a nice layout, just showing you the differences between the axial muscles of the torso and head, and then of course the appendicular muscles of the arms and legs. And this is a delicious looking birria taco. I'm a huge taco fan. I hope you are too. Now we're going to discuss fascicle organization. In fascicle organization, muscle fibers are grouped into fascicles, and the architecture of the fascicles provides important clues as to the range of motion and power that muscles develop. The first type of fascicle organization is a parallel muscle fascicle arrangement. Here, the fascicles are going to run parallel to the long axis of the muscle. Most muscles in the body are parallel, and examples of this would be biceps brachii, the sternocleidomastoid, and they generate force only along a single axis. They can shorten and only to about 30% of their original length. They vary in overall shape. Some are flat with broad attachments. These attachments would be aponeuroses. That's going to be connective tissue that would connect muscle to muscle. Some are plump and cylindrical with longer tendon attachments to the bone. The parallel muscle has a central body or belly, and like I said, it can shorten up to 30%, and the result of the individual muscle fiber shortening and the tension depends on the total number of myofibrils engaged in that muscle fiber contraction. So here's an example of parallel fascicle arrangement. We can see again the muscle fascicles are parallel to the long axis of the muscle, and it has a large body that tapers at either end. The next type is convergent muscle. Again, using that name, we can see that it's going to converge at a specific point. Here, the fascicles extend over a broad area, converging on a common attachment site and looking like a fan-like pattern. It has a versatile action. Different portions can contract to pull in different directions, and the entire muscle can contract. It does not pull as hard on the attachment site compared to parallel muscles. An example of this is going to be pectoralis major. Here we can see again that converging muscle fascicle arrangement where it's that fan-like structure where it all meets at a specific point or the tendon. The base of the muscle that you can see here is actually going to be the origin of the pectoralis major, which would actually be ribs 1 through 3, the sternum, the clavicle, and then it would insert directly onto the humerus. Next is going to be pinnate. Now, pinnate comes in a few different types, but pinnate means feather-like. Here, the fascicles are going to form a common angle with the tendon, and the fibers pull at that given angle. It does contain more fibers and myofibrils than parallel muscle of the same size. It's a more compact muscle, but it produces more tension, but less overall movement. We can see there are three types of pinnate: uni, bi, and multi. The unipinnate, all the fibers are on one side of the tendon, so it's just one feather. An example of this is extensor digitorum, which is going to actually be on the lateral aspect of your forearm. The bipennate example is going to be fibers that insert on both sides of the tendon. So it has two feathers. An example of this would be the rectus femoris, or your quad muscle. And then the final is multipennate. Here the tendon branches within pennate muscle, and it's going to have several different sections of this. An example of this, of course, would be the deltoid. Here we can see the different muscles that we discussed in the previous slide. Extensor digitorum, notice that unipennate structure, that kind of single feather where all of the muscle fibers converge at the tendon. We have a rectus femoris muscle in the upper quad where we have the two muscle fiber organizations that converge at the center line. And then finally, we have the deltoid muscle, which is going to be multipennate and connects via the three tendons directly to the deltoid tuberosity. The final type that we'll talk about is a circular muscle or sphincter. Circular fascicle arrangements are organized in concentric circles to encircle a duct, tube, or opening. The contraction of this is going to constrict the opening. Relaxation would open the opening. An example of these is going to be the orbicularis oris, orbicularis oculi, and then of course our external anal and urethral sphincter, and then of course we have the diaphragm as well. Here we can see examples of the circular fascicle arrangement. The orbicularis oris is directly around the mouth. We can see it contracted. It's going to close the mouth, purse the lips, relax would open. Now, it's important to remember that it's not just direction of the muscle fibers that matter when you think about force development. It's also how the muscle is connected, and we call this leverage. A lever is going to be a rigid structure. An example of this would be the bone itself, and it's used to lift something that pivots on a point called a fulcrum. The fulcrum in the body is going to be represented by the joint, and then the lever moves when force is applied, and this is muscle action. So a lever would be bone, the applied force would be muscle action, and the fulcrum would be the joint. There are three classes of levers that we're going to talk about. The first class of lever, the fulcrum is going to lie between the applied force and the load. It's going to work like a seesaw, as you can see from the diagram. The atlas occipital condyle here is going to form the fulcrum that various muscles like the sternocleidomastoid are going to act on to pivot the head back and forth. So take note, the fulcrum is going to be the center, and this is, like I said, going to be the occipital condyle that's going to be the fulcrum. We have a load that would be the skull, and it's going to push its way down. The applied force would be the muscle action of the back. So this is going to be the extensors of the actual neck, and it's going to contract and push the load up on the fulcrum. So it's going to work like a seesaw. In the second class of lever, the load is located between the applied force and the fulcrum, much like lifting a wheelbarrow. Here we can see the fulcrum would be the toes in the center as the load applies force down at the ankle. The applied force would be from the muscle actions of the gastrocnemius and the soleus that would produce plantar flexion. The final class of lever is going to be the most common in the body, and this is the third class of lever. Here, the force is applied between the load and the fulcrum. An example, one of the best ones that we have of this, is going to be doing a dumbbell curl. Here we can see that the fulcrum itself is actually going to be the elbow. The applied force is the biceps brachii, and the load is the dumbbell as it extends down. So the applied force will help to pull that lever, that overall lever, closer to the body. The applied force must be much greater than the load, but it results in the greatest amount of movement of the load overall and allows us to generate a lot of force. So reviewing a few functional terms, we're going to look at OIA, origin, insertion, and action. Remember that the origin is going to be the fixed end where muscle is going to originate from, the non-movable end. This is typically going to be proximal to the insertion once in anatomical position. Most of the origin sites in the body are bones, but some are connective tissue sheaths or bands. An example might be the interosseous membranes of the tibia fibula or of the radius and ulna. The insertion is the movable end of muscle. It's going to typically be a slightly longer tendon, and it's going to be where it attaches, and the insertion is going to move closer to the point of origin. We call this action, the specific movement of a skeletal muscle. So here's a simple example. Here we can see the origins of the biceps brachii muscle to the coracoid process in the glenoid cavity on both of the heads of the bicep. We can see the insertion on the radius. So that means the action is pulling the insertion closer to point of origin. Now, when discussing some muscle actions and how they actually work together, we're never isolating a specific muscle. Even when you think about isolation training and exercise and you're performing a dumbbell curl, you're not just isolating the biceps brachii. You're actually using a multitude of muscles together. But there is a primary or agonistic muscle that you're actually working. And this is the muscle whose contraction is chiefly responsible for producing a particular movement. We're going to keep using the dumbbell or bicep curl as the example for this. So the example here, the prime mover for the agonist would be the biceps brachii for elbow flexion. Also could be the brachialis. Synergist means working together. Here, a muscle that helps a larger agonist work efficiently, and it may provide additional pull or stabilize the origin. An example here would be the brachioradialis for elbow flexion. It's going to stabilize the elbow while biceps brachii and brachialis can actually initiate elbow contraction. This is a synergist. A fixator is a specific type of synergist that assists by preventing movement at another joint. So in this case, it might be like latissimus dorsi, at the back could be a fixator as it fixes the shoulder into position so that you can properly perform a dumbbell curl. It could also be some of the muscles of the forearm that are going to stabilize the wrist during the curl as well. These would be examples of fixators. The antagonist works in opposition to the prime mover or agonist. It's a muscle whose action opposes those actions. So an example of this, if we're talking about that dumbbell curl, would be triceps brachii, as this is an elbow extender, whereas the biceps brachii is elbow flexion. So let's put all of that together. Here we can see it laid out. We have the agonist or prime mover in a dumbbell curl or elbow flexion, and that's going to be the biceps brachii. The antagonist for elbow flexion is going to be triceps brachii. And then we have, of course, the synergist down there that's going to be brachioradialis, that's going to help to stabilize the elbow for flexion. Now, when looking at muscle terminology, there are various terms in the names of muscles that provide information about the muscle. This is to kind of help you remember the muscles a little bit more easily. So in some cases, we'll have specific regions of the body, like femoris. If you see the term femoris, you know it's going to be located somewhere on the upper thigh or femur. We might have position, direction, or fascicle organization. So orbicularis, rectus. Rectus means straight. Orbicularis means orb-like or circular. Different structural characteristics of the muscle. So the nature of the origin, the nature of the shape, how many heads of the muscle that it has. Is it a bicep, tricep, quadricep, to where there's multiple connections? We can also, of course, have the muscle actions. All the muscles of your inner thigh, for example, are called adductors because they perform adduction. Familiarity with these terms is going to help in identifying and remembering specific muscles. So some examples here, terms indicating specific regions of the body. We have, of course, abdominis, brachial. Abdominis means abdomen, brachial, brachium. Capitis means head, carpi, wrist, so on and so forth. We have other terms indicating position, direction, or fascicle organization. So when looking at the anterior muscles, external or on the outside, like external oblique, extrinsic, outside the structure. Inferior means below. So if we have different inferior muscles, we might have a superior as well. Oblique means slanting. Posterior means on the back. Additionally, some other terminology we can use, nature of the origin. A bicep has 2 heads, tricep has 3 heads, quadricep 4 heads. The shape of the muscle, like I've talked about, deltoid is triangular, orbicularis is circular. Other striking features, brevis means short, magnus means large, major is going to be larger, minimus is going to be small. terms indicating actions. We talked about adductors. There's also abductors, depressors, things that cause lowering, extensors, things that straighten, flexors, things that shorten the joint and close it off, levators, things that raise. Other things are very specific to regions. Things like buccinator is going to mean like trumpeting or cheek. Risorus means laughter, and serratorus is like a tailor, so of how it actually comes down at the angle and wraps around. Now we're going to start to look at the muscles of the body. This is going to be a very general overview of some key muscles that you'll want to know, and is not going to be fully in-depth anatomical breakdown. For that, you'll have to go to the visible body lab portion. Here we're first going to talk about the axial muscle groups. These are going to stabilize the position of the head, neck, and trunk. And they're in 4 major muscle groups. The first 2 are going to be the muscles of the head and neck, and then the muscles of the vertebral column. Here we can see the muscles of the head and neck that are actually going to form the basis for facial expression and eating and communication. Nearly all are going to originate on the skull and then insert onto either bones of the fascia, dermis, or skin. The other section we can see here, we can see that muscles of the trunk, specifically of the posterior trunk, that are heavily involved in stabilizing the spine. The other 2 major muscle groups of the axial muscle group system is going to be the oblique and rectus muscles of the trunk and the muscles of the pelvic floor. Here we can actually see all the muscles of the trunk that are going to help to stabilize the torso, make sure it stays upright, and brace the body during movement. And then the muscles of the lower pelvis that, again, are going to aid in the same capacity as the abdominis and help to keep a lot of the organs in, stabilize and brace during movement, and be involved in, of course, digestion and defecation and urination. Now, we'll start with the muscles of the facial expression. In general, all of the muscles of facial expression are going to originate on the skull, except for the platysma. The insertion of these muscles is going to be into the superficial fascia or dermis of the skin, and that is because these muscles are going to be involved in facial expression. So they're going to actually move the muscles, the skin of the face around. Now this is going to be a diagram of the muscles of facial expression. Some general muscles of facial expression listed here are going to be the buccinator, which functions to compress the cheeks and is essential for controlling food during mastication. This is also along with the orbicularis oris around the mouth that you can see there. And this is used for sucking in infants as well as whistling. The muscles above the actual eye that look like weird little furrowed caterpillars are called the corrugators superciliae. This is a frequent target of cosmetic doctors of Botox injection to reduce anger wrinkles because these are going to furrow the brow and bring the eyebrows in. The orbicularis oculi is very similar in structure to the orbicularis oris, and this surrounds the eye and causes squinting. There are 5 muscle sets involved in smiling: the zygomaticus, major and minor, the risorus, the orbicularis oculi, levator labii superioris, and levator anguli oris. Zygomaticus are bilateral muscles that pull up the corners of the mouth. The risorus is going to pull the corner of the mouth to the side, also is involved in laughing expressions. The orbicularis oculi causes the crinkling of the eyes, and that's how you can know whether or not a smile is genuine, is if the eyes actually crinkle. Levator labii superioris is going to pull up the corner of the lip and nose, and levator anguli oris is going to work in conjunction with the zygomaticus to help elevate the angle of the mouth. This is another good view of some of the muscles of the mouth and cheek. We can also see those muscles involved in smiling: the zygomaticus, the risorus, the orbicularis oculi, levator labii superioris, and levator anguli oris. Next are the muscles of mastication at the temporomandibular joint. There are relatively few muscles of the face that are involved in chewing, although other facial muscles may contribute to eating. Here, the origins of all of these mastication muscles are going to be on the zygomatic arch, temporal lines, and the lateral thyroid plates. Insertion is going to be the mandibular ramus and coronoid process, and the action is going to be elevating or sliding the mandible and moving it around. Here we can see a nice layout of many of these muscles. The actions of chewing are going to be elevation and depression, so this is the opening and closing. Retraction and protraction, so pushing the jaw forward and pulling it back, and then lateral movement to involve this as well. As far as the muscles involved in mastication, they are the masseter, which is going to close and protract the jaw, the temporalis, which is going to close and retract the jaw, and the lateral and medial thyroid muscles, which are going to be underneath the mandible, deep two. These are going to be involved in side-to-side and grinding movements. Now, just inferior to the actual mandible is going to be the hyoid bone. If you remember the hyoid bone from the skeletal system, we talked about this small, thin, curved bone that is suspended via a set of ligaments, and it's actually not going to articulate with any other bones. So because of this, the movement is going to be quite unique, and it moves quite a bit. The contraction of these different muscles attached to the hyoid are responsible for several different actions. So the digastric and mylohyoid perform depression of the mandible. They're going to work in conjunction with some of the other mandibular muscles. The elevation of the larynx is going to be involved with the mylohyoid, the thyrohyoid, sternohyoid, and stylohyoid. So it's going to move the larynx up. The elevation of the larynx is critical to facilitate the closing of the epiglottis during swallowing. So the hyoid itself, as it moves, it's going to help close off the epiglottis and force food down the esophagus. Now, depression of the hyoid, which pulls it back into position, is controlled via the mylohyoid, thyrohyoid, sternohyoid, and stylohyoid. This is also going to be involved with speaking as well. Moving on to the vertebral column, here there are a lot of muscles that are arranged in several layers, and they are going to help with flexion, extension, lateral flexion or the bending of both ways, and then rotation. So the movement, twisting side to side action. The entire muscle mass of the vertebral column is going to extend from sacrum to skull. Each muscle group is composed of numerous separate muscles of various lengths, and the subdivisions are also based on the proximity of the vertebral column. The major muscle groups of the spinal column, vertebral column, are going to be the erector spinae complex, and this is going to consist of the iliocostalis, longissimus, and semispinalis muscles. They are going to be named at different areas depending upon where they actually originate and insert, but overall you can refer to these as the erector spinae muscles, and they are going to be involved in the actual extension of the spine as well as support both laterally and anteriorly, and they brace during rotation. Here we can see on one side going up the entire length of the vertebral column is again going to be the different muscles of the erector spinae complex. But then if we notice deeper down, connecting to the hip bone is going to be the quadratus lumborum. The quadratus lumborum is your deepest abdominal muscle on the posterior aspect, and it's found in that lower back region. It's going to be on the top of the pelvis and connected to your lowest rib. The quadratus lumborum is going to help to support good posture and to stabilize your spine when you bend side to side. So this is a very important muscle to train during any sort of hinging movement or picking things up off the ground. Now, just as a general reminder for this, remember that many of the muscles of the vertebral column are extensors. We have very few flexors in the vertebral column. And it doesn't need a massive series of flexors because many of the trunk muscles on the front side are going to flex the vertebral column, and most of the body weight is anterior to the vertebral column, so gravity tends to naturally flex the spine. So that means your posterior side is going to be primarily extensor based. Moving to the anterior side of the body, we have muscles of the trunk wall that share embryological origins. Both oblique and rectus muscles form the muscle walls of the trunk and are arranged in different layers. The actions of many trunk wall muscles are going to assist in breathing and also help during bracing. So the scalene muscles that we can see here are three paired muscles with anterior, middle, and posterior located in the lateral aspect of the neck. Collectively, they form part of the floor of the posterior triangle of the neck, and the scalenes are accessory muscles of respiration that also perform flexion at the neck, allowing the ribs and neck to move. Moving down from the neck, we can actually see some of the other abdominal muscles. Here we can see the rectus abdominis just behind the rectus sheath. Just next to that is the external oblique. Deep to the external oblique is the internal oblique, and deeper to that is the transverse abdominis. Your abdominal muscles are going to be involved in compression of the abdominal wall and are accessory muscles for breathing when exaggerated breathing is required. We can also see next to the ribs the internal and external intercostals that are again involved in more labored breathing. The serratus anterior is going to also help with breathing, but primarily stabilize the shoulder. Now we're looking at a transverse diagram where we've cut the human body in half and are looking straight down. Separating the abdominal pelvic cavity from the actual lung and pericardial cavity is going to be the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a circular muscular arrangement. Here we can see the central tenon of the diaphragm as it braces in and connects to the outer ribcage wall. And anytime it contracts, it's actually going to be breathing in and increasing the size of the lungs. When you breathe out, the diaphragm will relax and go back to its original position, allowing air to flow out, decreasing the total volume of the lungs. The diaphragm is going to help with the abdominal muscles to brace the overall abdominal pelvic cavity. We can also see some of the arrangements of the abdominal muscles on the anterior aspect and the erector spinae group on the back. So you can see how all of these muscles together create a barrel that we can actually use to brace ourselves during any type of strenuous movement. This is another good diagram as we work our way down from the diaphragm into the abdominal pelvic cavity. We can actually see the different layers of muscle of the abdominal muscles. So the rectus abdominis on the front, we can see the external and internal obliques, and then the rectus abdominis that would be a little bit deeper to that. So this is going to be the final slide of the lecture, and this is showcasing an inferior view of the diaphragm. We can see the actual attachment sites down at the vertebral column and as it extends around to several of the ribs and braces into the quadratus lumborum. This is very interesting because the diaphragm itself, when you breathe, is going to help to move the actual intervertebral discs. So it performs a natural kind of decompression when you deep breath in. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive list of all the muscles of the axial skeletal group, and it's not meant to be. This lecture was merely meant to serve as kind of an overview, covering some of the major muscle groups that we kind of care about in this lecture series. To go greater in depth, please go to Visible Body and go through all of the different lab dissection courses and start to learn all of the different muscles of the actual axial skeletal system. I would focus a little bit more on some of the superficial muscles and then gradually work deeper. But muscles are going to make up a bulk of what we study later on in the kinesiology field.